What is happening when Jesus dies on the cross? What does it mean? What significance does it have? Well, that your understanding of that fundamentally depends on who you think he was. If you think that he was a good man, treated unfairly, and the victim of injustice and the betrayal of his friends and a corrupt religious and political system, then he is really just another good man who has suffered from the ultimate injustice. And it is a tragic story, but it is an all too common story that happened thousands of times in the centuries before Jesus' death and thousands of times in the centuries since. And there really isn't very much more to say about it than it was a terrible travesty of justice and a tragedy for his friends and followers. But if he is who he told Pilate he is in the trial, if he is the Son of God, Emmanuel, God with us, it is so much more than that. It is a story that changes everything and speaks directly to us now and tells us something about where God is now and where we can find God in the midst of the grief and the pain and the fear that we are facing together as a whole world in the grip of a pandemic. Jesus' crucifixion tells us something very important about God, and particularly about where God is when we are in the grip of the coronavirus, COVID-19. I think many people have wondered where God is at the moment as they've seen the terrible pictures of death and suffering that have been on our screens and coming through the airwaves over the last few months. When Jesus dies on the cross, if he is the Son of God, he is doing so much more than simply undergoing a horrendous death and being tortured to death unjustly. He is suffering and dying with us and for us. God's presence in Jesus on the cross, the second person of the Trinity being crucified and dying for us on Good Friday, is an assurance to us that God is with us whatever is happening to us and at every moment of our lives. And in particular, that God does not abandon us in our dying, but that God suffers with us and alongside us and accompanies us, shares with us in our griefs, in our loss, in our restrictions, in the stripping away of all that is good in our lives, and even in the sense that we might have of being abandoned by God. When Jesus cries, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" He is sharing a cry that many of us have felt in the face of grief and suffering, but at the same time, wonderfully, is also telling us that even in that painful experience, he is there, that God is with us, that God understands us and does not abandon us. When Christ cries that cry of despair on the cross, he is with the despairing, he is with the suffering, he is with the dying, and he accompanies us because of that through our dying and death, and then is able to meet us on the other side. And I've been reflecting particularly this year on the fact that the Roman method of execution, crucifixion, almost certainly the most cruel that human beings have ever devised, fundamentally was a suffocation. As the person being crucified was pinned to the cross, gradually as they became weaker, they were no longer able to hold themselves up with their arms, and they would no longer be able to breathe because of the weight of their whole body hanging from their ribs. How close to what the experience of those who are suffering from coronavirus at the moment is. So, just as at Christmas we celebrate Emmanuel, God with us, so on Good Friday we also know that Emmanuel, God is with us, not just on that terrible day, but with us in the worst of days when we face it. And more than that, we are told that God is not defeated or overwhelmed on those days as we face them, even if we are. Indeed, the hope and the goodness of Good Friday is that God is not overwhelmed by our suffering or our death or our despair or our grief, but also that God is not overwhelmed by our sin, by our stupidity, by our selfishness, by the wrong things that we do. Because as well as being with those who suffer, Christ is also presenting us with the worst of what it is to be human. In Pilate and Judas and the disciples who run away, in the soldiers who crucify him under what would have just been another day's work for them, he is showing us that no matter how low human beings sink, God cannot be defeated by us or our sin. And so he shows us that nothing can separate us from God and God's love, whatever is happening to us. And so, as we reflect on the mystery of the Passion,